I come in peace. Welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to honor your great Imam Ali on this International Day of Peace. Thank you also for the opportunity to honor Imam Ali's Popular Students Relief Society, which seeks to relieve injustice and suffering in the spirit of the great Imam, who said, "If poverty were a person, I would have killed him." Let Imam Ali also inspire our reflections upon peace with his wise words, "A person's worth depends upon the nobility of his aspirations, and knowledge is the root of all good." Now, to speak intelligently and responsibly about peace, we must seek to explain why peace has not yet been achieved. To explain this, we must first understand what peace is. So let me start with that. Peace is a condition of a social system in which conflicting claims among its participants are effectively resolved through rule-based and rule-governed procedures without resort to violence or the threat of violence. Procedures are rule-governed when they are reliably followed, pre-announced rules about how decisions are made and by whom. Procedures are rule-based when they rely on the interpretation and application of pre-announced authoritative rules. Now, the paradigm example of both features are courts. Courts are rule-governed, their proceedings are governed by rules, and they are also rule-based in that they interpret and apply pre-existing rules. Legislatures are rule-governed, but they are not rule-based. They make the rules rather than follow pre-existing rules, except at the margins, they do comply with pre-existing rules, for example, those laid down in a constitution. Now, I want to distinguish two different kinds of peace. One that you might call genuine peace, and another kind of peace that is really intermediate between war and peace. I will start with that intermediate kind of peace, which is the one that we now have at the international level, and I will call that kind of peace a modus vivendi. A modus vivendi is a peace that is based on prudence, on rational prudence of its participants. Here, shared rules persist over time if and so long as the participants in the modus vivendi are known to have sufficient prudential reasons for compliance. Now, what the prudential reasons of a participant are depends on this participant's interests, on their threat potential, and on their vulnerabilities. A modus vivendi can last through changes in the interests and power of its participants, but only through renegotiation of the rules. What happens here is that a flexible equilibrium is preserved among the participants because those participants who become stronger are accommodated. They are given more favorable terms of cooperation, whereas those participants who become weaker are obliged to accept less favorable terms of cooperation. And it's prudent for those who become weaker to accept a worsening of their terms because it's overwhelmingly prudent for them to want the parties who become stronger to continue to comply. they don't want war. And because they don't want war, they will be willing to accept less favorable terms that reflect their weakening bargaining power. And here we see already that one particular feature of a modus vivendi is that it is liable to inequality spirals, to spirals where a party gets weaker, then accepts less favorable terms of cooperation. These less favorable terms will further weaken that party. The party will then accept a further weakening of the terms of collaboration and so on, until in the end the party becomes extremely weak. One example of that could be that a person will accept slavery because he is now or she is now too weak to defend herself effectively against others. Or a state may give up some territory to other states because it is weak and wants to preserve peace, but having given up some territory, it's become weaker and even less able to defend itself, and thereby may, because it's become weaker, be forced to make even further concessions. A modus vivendi is then a flexible equilibrium that at any given time reflects the bargaining power of the various participants. Now, again, a modus vivendi has a surface of civility. Everybody complies with the rules. Everybody is kind of civil in resolving their differences in a rule-based way. But underneath the surface, the modus vivendi is an all-out struggle for power that ultimately is unlimited. There's no limit to what a rising participant may do to its rivals, and there's no limit to what a declining participant may prudently accept, prudently concede in preference to all-out war. Now, understanding this, any participant in a modus vivendi must prioritize its own survival and power over everything else. And that includes its own values. So when I participate in a modus vivendi, I cannot afford to constrain my conduct even by my own values, because in doing so, I would be handicapping myself in a potentially deadly long-term competition. And this is really very painful for all the participants in the modus vivendi who have any kind of genuine values, religious values, moral values, whatever. They have to violate these values all the time. They have to do dirty, horrible things in order to maintain their power, because ultimately in a modus vivendi, the preservation of power is crucial to one's own long-term survival. And this preservation of one's own power also happens in a way for the sake of one's own values, because if I die, if I don't survive, then my values die with me. They also don't survive. And so it is ultimately for the sake of preserving my own values that I have to violate those very same values in the competition for power that is organized by a particular modus vivendi. In order to avoid a long-term power decline, a kind of spiral that we saw earlier, I have to fight with no holds barred. I have to maximize my own power and disregard my own values. So this shows us that a modus vivendi is incompatible with any kind of genuine, stable, perpetual peace. A modus vivendi isn't such a peace. It can last for a long time, but it will always be liable to shifts in power. Now let's think about this power thing a little bit more in detail. Political power has three different sources. There's military power, the capacity for violence. There's economic power, the control over resources. And then there is soft power, which is a grab bag of everything else. Charisma, for example, being respected, being acknowledged as trustworthy and a moral leader. These are the kinds of things that may give you soft power. Now, when you ask which of these three types of power, these three sources of power, is the most important, the answer is it depends. It depends on the context. In a context of active war, of course, military power is all important. The other two don't matter very much. In a context of peace, on the other hand, soft power may be quite important. And so the exchange rate among these three different types of power depends on the context that we are in. And that means that diverse agents have conflicting interests with regard to the context. If I am especially strong militarily and not so strong in economic and soft power, then I want the world to be close to war. I want it to be a world of tension, of crisis, of hostility, a world in which my military power matters a lot. On the other hand, if I am strong in terms of soft power or economic power, stronger anyway than I am in military power, then I want the world to be in the opposite condition. I want the world to be one that is not full of tension, hostility, rivalry, crisis. This diversity of interest in our world is manifested, for example, by countries like Israel or Russia. On one side, they are strong militarily, but not so strong in other respects. Israel, Pakistan, Russia. And then at the other extreme, you have countries like Japan, which are strong economically, but not particularly strong militarily. And they would prefer the world to be one in which there is not so much tension, crisis, and hostility. Now, the same conflicting interests with regard to context also exist intra-nationally. So if you have three branches of government, you have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The executive will always be interested in a climate of tension and hostility, because it will then have, in such a context, more power vis-à-vis the other two branches of government. On the other hand, the judiciary and the legislature will be more interested in a climate of peace and stability, relative peace and stability, because there they will have more power vis-à-vis the executive. Similarly, corporations that are in the arms business, that manufacture weapons, are interested in a climate of hostility, crisis, rivalry, because that is where their goods are most needed and they are most appreciated. Whereas other businesses, other corporations may be more interested in a climate of international cooperation and friendship. Now, there is an important asymmetry in this competition over the context. Those who want the context to be one of crisis, tension, and hostility will always find it easier to make that happen than the other side, those who are interested in peace, friendship, and calm. The reason is obvious. It's much easier to create crises and tensions and hostilities than to get rid of them. And so a modus vivendi will almost always be a context in which there is a whole lot of tension, hostility, and crisis. you see it now in the pre-election period in the United States, where the president is quite obviously interested in creating international tension and hostility in order to improve his own power and his own image and his own importance. He is trying to create a bit of a crisis, maybe with Iran, maybe with China, whatever, whereas the other party and also the legislature are interested in avoiding that and playing it down a little bit. Anyway, as a general rule, we can say that because of that asymmetry in the ability to influence the context, a modus vivendi will generally be in a state of crisis, hostility, tension, because those who have an interest in that, and there will always be some participants in the modus vivendi who have that interest, will find it easy to get their way, much easier than those on the other side. Now, this may seem to suggest that we can never get out of a modus vivendi. If the parties in a modus vivendi cannot live up to their own values, have to prioritize national security and survival over everything else, and if those who are interested in and benefit from tension and hostility can always find a way to create these tensions and hostilities and crises, then it seems we are forever stuck in a modus vivendi. Now, I really think that that is almost true. It is very, very difficult to get out of a modus vivendi, and the world has been in such a modus vivendi for a long, long time, either a war or modus vivendi. We have never had any kind of genuine peace in the world. Still, I believe that genuine peace is possible. And the best way to see that is to look at the most advanced national societies. In these national societies, genuine peace prevails. And what we have in these societies is, for example, a state without violence, where violence and threats of violence are no longer significant sources of political influence, in which even economic inequality is no longer such a big factor, where really political influence is exercised through voting, and every citizen has one vote. People have equal political influence. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how well armed you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. In the end, in these few very advanced national societies, people are more or less equal, and political power is exercised not through violence, not through wealth, but through the ballot box, through voting. In these societies, it's also true that minorities are very well protected through common values. Communities securely enjoy the freedom to organize themselves according to their own values, insofar as that's consistent with the shared values of the national order. And everyone in the society will come to their defense and will protect them if any bully tries to threaten them and undermine their ability to freely organize themselves. And there's one other thing that is true in such societies, namely that government and state agencies and officials are impartial. They are, in their official capacity, loyal to the whole nation and its shared values, rather than to their own families, to their own province, to their own religious communities. And that is a fantastic achievement, that even though officials may love their families very much, in their official role, they give no special priority to even their very nearest relatives. This sort of anti-nepotism is an enormous civilizational achievement. People who exercise public offices are despised and kicked out when they are nepotistic, when they favor their near and dear and are not strictly impartial. And people in these advanced societies are shunning corruption. They actually are impartial and prioritize justice and the common good of the society over their own personal loyalties and commitments. This sort of impartiality extends even to ordinary citizens who, of course, in their private capacity, show loyalty to their family and to their friends and to their neighbors, but as voters, strictly commit themselves to justice and the common good. So that is a hallmark of these societies, and this is exactly what we need to achieve at the international level. If there is ever to be international peace, then our international officials must be impartial. They must forget about the particular state that they come from, and of course about their particular family, about their particular religion, about all their affiliations, and in their official capacity, they must practice strict impartiality. They must be committed only to justice and the common good of all of humankind. Violence and the threat of violence must be completely irrelevant and absent from such an international order. Economic inequalities must be much more moderate and no longer a major source of political domination. And countries must securely enjoy the freedom to organize themselves according to their own values, consistent with and protected by globally shared values and their embodiment in the global order. No matter how small and weak a country might be, other countries will leave it alone, will give it its own freedom, and if any stronger country tries to bully a weaker country, all the other countries of the world and all the international agencies will come to the weaker country's defense, just as in a just nation state, all the citizens will come to the defense of a weak and vulnerable citizen who is being bullied by a criminal, by some big, powerful actor. In such a world, new and old global institutions such as the United Nations or the World Trade Organization, for example, would be led and staffed by officials who are loyal to humanity and its shared values and principles, rather than loyal to their home country. So in their official capacities, as UN officials or WTO officials, these people would be strictly impartial. They would completely forget which country they come from and execute the tasks of their office only inspired by impartial rules, impartially administered. This contrasts very much with what we have today. Today, there's a big struggle every time among countries over the important offices in our international order, because everybody understands that if the president of the World Bank, for example, is an American citizen, then he, rarely she, he will execute that office of president of the World Bank in the interest of his home country. We all understand that. We don't really quite accept it, but we regard it as more or less inevitable. And that is why there is so much fighting and arm twisting over the occupying of these offices. The Americans want that job and they're willing to negotiate, and then they give the Europeans some other job, because everybody understands that the people occupying these positions will in the end be loyal to their home countries. So what I've done is I've sketched in a very loose and preliminary way the features of the kind of international order that we need to strive for. In any case, states need to not only fight in the existing modus vivendi, try to maximize their power and protect their own survival and security, but states should also think about a more long-term, clear and attractive vision for a world beyond modus vivendi. And they should shape their foreign policies and international design initiatives so that these manifestly accord with that vision. We all, as academics and as thinking citizens, should think about how we can conceive a genuinely peaceful international order and what steps we can take to get to that order. We don't have a lot of time. There is a real possibility of a third world war happening. A modus vivendi is always a dangerous situation to be in. In each particular year, the probability of a major war may be small, but in the long run, over a decade, 2, 3, 4 decades, 10 decades, 50 decades, it is almost a certainty that a major such war will occur, and with modern technologies, such a war may end the whole human experiment. This is why it is very urgent that we make this kind of progress toward genuine peace. To conclude, I leave you once again with some quotes from our great Imam Ali, who inspires us over a distance of 1360 years. Imam Ali said, "Give your enemy 1,000 chances to become your friend, but do not give your friend a single chance to become your enemy." Forgiveness is the crown of greatness. The first to apologize is the bravest. The first to forgive is the strongest. The first to forget is the happiest. And finally, remember that people are of two kinds. They are either your siblings in religion or your siblings in humankind. Let us all be siblings. Let us all work toward genuine peace in this world. Thank you.